So, without further ado, let's go to our keynote lecture. I'm pleased to introduce Helen Lambert. Now, she's Professor of Medical Anthropology at the University of Bristol. She works with, well, there's a long introduction, but I will summarise because there's a lot to say. She works with the Global Challenges Research Fund. She has expertise in socio-cultural aspects of health and healthcare, infectious disease, and AMR. She leads something called the Newton Fund, which is a collaboration, as I understand it, between the UK and China, and provides social science input on an MRC, Medical Research Council, and Department of Health and Social Care COVID-19 study. So there's lots to say, but I'm just going to leave it there, other than Helen's going to start with a little bit of general info on social science and AMR, then move on to a case example of interdisciplinary work from the Newton Fund with China to illustrate the process of embedding interdisciplinarity into data collection. Well, I'm looking forward to it. So thank you. Helen, over to you.
Thanks very much, Becky. I'm delighted to be here. I am actually in Bristol. I understand that I have a very mixed audience here, and it's an intriguing experience not to really know who one's speaking to. And as you know, if you've presented on Zoom before, a slightly disconcerting experience. So what I'm going to do is to start by saying some very broad initial things about the role of social science research in AMR, which probably will be very familiar to those of you who already have social science backgrounds, but may perhaps be a useful orientation for those of you who come from bench sciences or the life sciences or another background. And then I'm going to move on to a case study, and I will try in around 30 minutes to describe some of the processes which are involved in actually trying to integrate different disciplines in a real project, rather than just notionally, as we tend to say blithely we're going to do when we submit research proposals. I'm going to say a bit about methodological triangulation. Then I'm going to go on to talk about the process of deciding on who is going to participate in your study and how that makes a big difference what discipline you're coming from when you make those decisions. If I have time, I'll say a little bit about trying to combine data types and sources in order to answer a specific research question. And then I'm going to say a little bit, coming back to issues of social science, on the language of antibiotics. And at the bottom there, I've put those phrases, social science and interdisciplinary, in inverted commas, just to highlight the fact that these are both variable and contested terms that are used in different ways by different people, and that you'll find utilized differently in the literatures you read. So to start with, I simply want to acknowledge that I think we're all very much aware that antimicrobial resistance, while being a quote problem of biological evolution, is not solely biological. And that means in turn that the solutions we may try to come up with for tackling AMR are not necessarily confined to technological ones, although those have always been prominently highlighted in popular media, such as the development of new diagnostic tests or indeed new antibiotics. And in turn, how we frame our problem of AMR influences what solutions we think about, what we research, and what we invest in. And I think that's important to remember. When we think about the determinants of AMR, it's important to realize that AMR is driven by human action. And there's a huge range of societal drivers which contribute to that. And those drivers and the consequences of those actions are socially patterned. Likewise, the potential of existing interventions or new interventions to tackle AMR is ultimately largely dependent on these social dimensions. So even if you have a fantastic new point of care test, whether that will be utilized appropriately and effectively depends on a huge range of social variables, from how the clinician chooses to use it, to who turns up at the health centre, who agrees to have that diagnostic test, and then how that test results are interpreted, and the extent to which they actually are followed in then prescribing antibiotics. To document and understand these action drivers of AMR is important, because we need to know how and where to intervene, and also how to intervene and how to assess change over time to understand whether our interventions are useful. And so social science and behavioural science is very important in this respect. But also, as you're training in different disciplines, it's also important to remember that people who come from a social science background may also want to be able to develop, to do research which is going to contribute to their own disciplinary store of knowledge and to the theory that is built within that discipline. And those two things, its practical usage and its contribution to the broader social science discipline, sometimes sit in tension in interdisciplinary projects, particularly when it comes to writing up outputs which will be valuable to the community of scientists and social scientists that you want to contribute to, but also, of course, in terms of developing and building your career. And I will come back very briefly to that at the end. But there are many social sciences that can contribute to the study of AMR. I've put a list there below, which is drawn from the Economic and Social Research Council's list of disciplines that they fund. And I've highlighted psychology and economics in bold, because to date, those have been the most visible and the most extensively contributing disciplines in the field of AMR. And some social science disciplines are closely aligned with their application to AMR research, such as behavioural psychology. Others, like anthropology, the discipline that I come from, are less obviously well aligned, and so there is sometimes that tension that I've just mentioned between the production of empirical data that may be valuable for an interdisciplinary project and the generation of knowledge and theory which is recognised by disciplinary peers as anthropological or geographical or political. So with that brief backdrop, without more ado, I'm going to spend the next maybe 15 minutes or so talking you through a case study on how you go about integrating some of these disciplines with others in an actual research project, which was a 3-year study funded by the Newton Fund. That's to say bilateral funding from UKRI, led by MRC in the UK, and from NSFC, the National Natural Science Foundation of China in China. And we completed this study in December 2018. And the two PIs here, the little people at the front, me and my colleague, Devin Wang. So what we wanted to try to do in this project was to investigate these 3 primary aims: the key drivers of antibiotic use, including treatment seeking and clinical practice, but those drivers being a very broad range of social, cultural, health system, economic, behavioural determinants. To carry out a microbiological feasibility study to characterise pathogens in relation to presenting symptoms and diagnoses, particularly focusing on respiratory tract and urinary tract infections, and to try to, for the first time, ascertain antibiotic resistant rates in a community population. That's to say, outside tertiary hospitals, from which all of the surveillance data emanating from China is drawn on. And thirdly, to assess the potential for using patient records to monitor antibiotic use. So if you think about those questions, you'll see you can broadly divide them into different disciplinary areas: social science for the first one, microbiology for the second, and epidemiology for the third. And likewise, in terms of our list of principal research questions, we can, broadly speaking, tag them as relating to different domains, disciplinary domains, all of which were included in the co-investigators for this study. So we had representatives for all these disciplines. Rather than going through what these questions were, which you'll grasp as I go through this case study, the question I want to focus on in the next few minutes is, how do you operationalize these questions in a research project? And more specifically, how do you integrate the different disciplinary assumptions and methodological approaches which these different disciplines bring to the study? To answer that, I think we can say there are two ways of doing that. The first, theoretical, and the second, practical. That's to say, it's part of a methodological process. And I want to go through both of those two ways. So first, the theoretical. In the design of this study, as an anthropologist, I was able to draw on a set of conceptual frameworks from my own field of medical anthropology that I will now spend a couple of minutes explaining. I should confess here that I never really discussed this conceptual framing with my collaborators while we were actually developing how to go about doing this study, but it did become apparent to some of them over time. So you can see here in the blue boxes three aspects which we were trying to triangulate in the study. In terms of our first objective on the top left, the documentation of patterns of treatment seeking arise ultimately from patient experience. So seeking treatment ultimately comes from a person having the perception of being unwell in some sense. And so it emerges from the experience of illness, which prompts seeking treatment from various possible sources of healthcare, and perhaps accessing it at the village clinics and township health centres, which we were studying. Secondly, the patient may turn up at a healthcare facility and be diagnosed clinically, that is to say, on the basis of the symptoms they report to the clinician, and this will then lead to a diagnosis. Thirdly, on the bottom right blue rectangle, this clinical diagnosis may be verified or supported or otherwise by the performance of microbiological tests. And that constitutes the third arm of our study. Now, the links between these three dimensions are interrupted or made more problematic by forms of what we could call interference. In the case of the relationship between patient experience and clinical diagnosis, we have the clinical encounter, which may lead to miscommunication. There may be differences in interpretation between the clinician and the patient about what is actually going on. In a similar way, there may be, quote, interference between the clinical diagnosis and the microbiological tests, including, among other things, pathogens which are cultured but are not necessarily the cause of the clinical illness that is seen by the clinician. And thirdly, whether or not the microbiological test results demonstrating pathology are commensurate with or reflected in patient experience. And that is the most problematic relation that we don't fully understand, but may perhaps have something to do with the severity of the illness. And these three things are linked in the triangle on the top right, illustrated in, highlighted in yellow, which is a triangle of signification. which is well understood in the field of medical anthropology and has been used as a theoretical construct for many years. And it links this subjective experience of ill health at the top, that's to say illness, with diagnosed disease on the bottom right, and the social recognition, who gets what and how it's recognized socially, which we characterize as sickness. And it's a classical focus of medical anthropological work to look at illness, the subjective experience, and what drives treatment seeking and antibiotic use, and also how local cultural constructs may be interpolated with and translated into local diagnostic categories. And I'll come back to this at the end of my case study. Secondly, there are the methodological issues. So to return to our study, I want to use the example of patient recruitment to illustrate how problematic it becomes when you're trying to square what different disciplines want to do in a study. So in our original proposal, we wanted to recruit patients with, quote, common respiratory tract infections, or RTIs. Now, to microbiologists, what they decided they wanted to do, how they wanted to operationalize that, was to include patients who had, on the one hand, exacerbated pulmonary disease or urinary tract infections. For the epidemiologists and the health service researchers, they wanted to operationalize common RTIs by recruiting people who had coughs, sore throat, and also patients who weren't being prescribed antibiotics. Now, the reasons you have these discrepancies is that for a sociologically meaningful study, learning about the use of antibiotics would mean ideally you want to recruit people based on what's actually happening in a clinic. So you want to see what patients are presenting with, and then clinical judgments about what they should get in terms of their prescriptions. And that means it's just as useful anthropologically or sociologically, maybe more useful, to include patients who don't turn out to have a bacterium causing their illness, but who are prescribed antibiotics, as those who do have such a bacterium. In fact, that tells us more about what's going on in that clinical encounter to lead antibiotics to be prescribed, even though there isn't a bacterial pathogen. Whereas for the microbiology, if you can only do 1,500 tests within your budget, which is the budget we had, the broader the range of samples you include, the lower the number of isolates that you will be able to culture. That means you want to target as narrowly as possible. And that is why our microbiologists were saying they want to recruit people with exacerbated chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and with UTIs, because those two conditions are mandated for antibiotics. You want to be prescribing antibiotics because you're pretty sure that they will have a bacterial infection. So this is the kind of thing that you argue about a lot if you're trying to do an interdisciplinary study. And we had to make clear what these assumptions were underlying our judgments, and we came up with a final set of inclusion criteria of urinary tract infections, respiratory tract infections with productive cough and sore throat. We were then able to proceed to doing our study and collect a shed load of data, which I've just listed in this slide on our research activities. So that first example was intended to give you a sense of how complex it becomes to operationalize what seems to be a fairly straightforward protocol of recruiting people with common respiratory tract infections in low-level healthcare settings in rural China. With the basis of we're doing all these studies, I then want to move on to my second example, which is that of an electronic record completeness study, which is in turn illustrating the empirical value of interdisciplinary working. So my epidemiological colleagues wanted to use patient records to analyse patterns and trends in antibiotic use, something that, as you know, is very widely done in the UK and across Europe and high-income countries where we have fairly universal and pretty reliable and accurate patient electronic records. The larger goal behind this was to gather baseline data so that once we'd finished this project and ascertained the key drivers of antibiotic use that were potentially modifiable, we could go on to design an intervention to optimize antibiotic use and then conduct a randomized controlled trial of that intervention. Ideally then, we could use patient records to monitor change over time and in future to see whether an intervention that we would develop and implement could be evaluated through the use of these secondary data. But to do this, we first had to establish how accurate the electronic records were. And so we initially designed a study that would compare electronic records with the paper written records that are used in these primary care clinics to determine the accuracy of the e-records and then do statistical analysis. Going into the field, however, we found, not particularly surprising for those of us who are social scientists, that the written records weren't always there, the electronic records weren't always there. So we devised a new protocol to use the observations we were already conducting in these clinics to compare against the electronic records which were submitted to county level. And we then reviewed retrospectively the clinical those records entered for the patients who we'd recruited into our study against the actual clinical consultations that we observed and recorded in our study. And we also did interviews with doctors and health centre directors. So our findings in brief were that you can see somewhere approaching 3/4 of patients did have electronic records, but the recording was extremely variable, as you can see from the bar charts on the left, ranging from 0% in one clinic to almost 100% in one of the township health centres. And this, by the way, does not cover the full range of clinics which we included in our study. We included only the first 2 sites for doing this electronic record completeness study. On the right-hand side, you can see that nearly 50%, just under half of the e-records differed in terms of the diagnosis from what we had observed. And 1/4 of the e-records didn't have any diagnosis at all. The broader point in terms of the value of having observational and qualitative work going on at the same time as the epidemiological study was that these e-records are only collated at county level, and so this variability would not necessarily have been apparent had we done what initially my colleagues wanted to do, which is a large data download. So you'd simply collect all the records and be able to analyse them statistically. We then looked at whether an antibiotic was prescribed, and as you can see, in about 50%, the electronic records showed that one antibiotic had been prescribed, 11% no antibiotics, and in 38% more than one antibiotic prescribed. And this was not hugely different, but somewhat different from our observations of prescription of antibiotics in our recruited patients, which overall totaled just under 90% of patients with common respiratory infections coming to clinics and being prescribed antibiotics. And finally, we looked at whether the antibiotics named on the electronic record matched the observation. And as you can see, interestingly, because there was such great variability and discrepancy in, for example, the recording of diagnoses and of the prescribing of antibiotics, in terms of the name of the antibiotic, there was a very high match with what we observed in clinic. I won't go through the rest of the reasons for these differences in detail, but this slide is just to illustrate how valuable it then was to have conducted direct observations and to have done interviews with both doctors and patients and seen the way in which these records were used, because we were able to discern, for example, the third bullet point down, that the purpose of these electronic systems are really for medical insurance reimbursement rather than for patient care. And this accounts for why the level of matching on the specific antibiotic name was so high, because reimbursement for drugs prescribed will occur only if that is entered into the system. Whereas for other issues, such as the diagnostic differences, patients may use family names to receive treatment. That in turn, because of the cap on medical insurance, means that doctors, for the very best of reasons, trying to provide care to their patients, may create a second electronic record so that somebody who's hit the cap of insurance reimbursement can still be treated by using one of their family's names who haven't hit that cap. And so there's a whole set of vagaries in the healthcare system which lead to electronic records not necessarily directly reflecting the reality that we observed.
Sorry, Helen, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We're going to have to wrap up a little bit if we want time for questions. Sorry.
Okay, mine is saying I'm at 25 minutes. I thought that I had 30. Is that incorrect?
Yes, I mean, if you're about to finish, it's only because we started running a little bit late. So if we could just do it.
Okay, if you want me to shorten, then I'll do that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So the final illustration I wanted to make was that this doesn't, that it's also possible for us to conduct work at the same time as interdisciplinary studies, which has clear value for one specific social science discipline. And during the course of this research, we looked in great detail at the understanding of antibiotics in this local setting as anti-inflammatory. And this understanding, which is embedded in traditional Chinese medical understanding as a causal mechanism for ill health, has become coded into language as anti-inflammation medicine. That does have clear practical implications for addressing antibiotic use, but it's also extremely interesting anthropologically, and I think gets to the heart of what I described earlier as a triad of signification between disease, illness, and sickness. And that has allowed us to publish work which addresses more of a core social science and humanities audience, as well as the more applied work that we've been able to publish. So I want obviously to thank the huge team of people who were involved in this project, and particularly highlighting those on the slide who contributed contributions of data in some of the PowerPoints I've just shown. I haven't quite finished yet. What I'll finish on though is to say that we've now gone on to be awarded a larger Newton Fund study as one of the 4 UK-China AMR hubs. And there's just here a poster about that and a screenshot of our website, which with the link on the slide, where our hub is called Strategies to Reduce the Burden of Antibiotic Resistance in China. It's a much broader study, including environmental transmission and drivers, as well as the RCT that I mentioned earlier, and a large health economics component. And currently we also have a Newton Fund Researcher Links workshop funding, and we're currently accepting applications for people to join the Challenge of AMR workshop, which will take place in October. So any of those PhD or postdoc students who are coming towards, who already have some research experience and who have an interest in AMR in China would be most welcome to apply to join our workshop, which will be a joint UK-Chinese workshop over 4 days in October. So just to conclude, a few thoughts on social science-led interdisciplinarity. Do interrogate the epistemological basis of others' assumptions when you're working with people from other disciplines, but embrace other methodologies and consider whether or how other disciplinary approaches other than that, which is your own core discipline, may help to answer your own research questions as well as theirs. And in reciprocation, also be ready to articulate and reflect on your own methodological assumptions. And finally, a watchword that we've had for long within Bristol AMR network more generally is, don't be afraid to ask stupid questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. That was a really, really interesting talk and a nice way for us to set the beginning of our meeting. I've got a few questions here, and if anyone else has questions while we're discussing these, please feel free to just enter them into the chat function. So the first question is, how important is it to understand the culture of treatment-seeking behavior before one even thinks about setting up an empirical research project?
What research project? An empirical research project?
Yes, yeah.
Well, obviously it depends on what you want to research, but if you are trying to research any aspect which is inflected by people's treatment-seeking choices, I think it's really important to understand at least some minimal aspects of treatment-seeking. I've been involved in, for example, looking at appraising work that's been done on the development of diagnostic tests, when it has become very clear at a relatively late stage in the development that test developers are simply making the assumption that there's universal access to testing facilities in tertiary hospitals for the whole population. In other words, they haven't the first idea that people may in fact be choosing other forms of treatment or not accessing a sort of clinical environment where those tests could be utilized. Mm-hmm. I hope that goes some way to answering your question.
Yes, that does, thanks. Well, I hopefully do, whoever did ask that question, but I think that was good. I'm going to slightly combine the next two questions that have come in because they're quite practical questions that I think would be helpful for those of us here who are mostly early career researchers. So could you speak a little bit about negotiating access to different kinds of data in an interdisciplinary project? So where you have a social survey, administrative records, biological samples, sort of just how that was done as a team or individually, and I guess attached to that, how you navigated the aspects of research budget constraints. As interdisciplinary projects, were these accounted for across the disciplines in separate allocated funding?
Okay, so in terms of data access, I assume you're not meaning how do you actually practically go about accessing, for example, patient records in a specific country setting, but rather different disciplines wanting to be able to access each other's data and understand what was there. I became much more heavily involved than I would ever have imagined as a qualitative, essentially ethnographer, in the details of setting up databases and how you create data linkage across data sets, and was hugely assisted. We were in this enterprise by our colleague Simon Cheng, known as Sharon, who was a whiz at coding and was able to set up an online database which was accessible from both the UK and China, and into which we managed to include most of the forms of data, although not, of course, qualitative, the actual interview transcripts. But we were able to post audio files online. This is something that we've been doing a lot in the study that I'm also involved in, led by Matthew, on One Health drivers of AMR in Thailand. Because we have limited expertise, though, of course, it does ultimately rely greatly on each of the individual disciplines doing sufficient preliminary analysis and, as it were, translating the data that's coming in their own work stream or work package to the other disciplinary contributors to help to make sense of that. And that's where, you know, communication across the team is absolutely essential, because even if I had access to the microbiological data set, for example, I wouldn't be able to make much of it. And so that process of translation and interpreting results, initial findings to each other, is tremendously important and does need to happen, as I've found in the past to my cost, at repeated time points during the study, because you can actually go down sort of an avenue which is terribly interesting sociologically, let's say, but is of little or no value if you haven't realized that the emerging findings from the clinical work or the epidemiology demonstrate that that path is not of any interest. It's not actually important in terms of thinking about determinants. It's a little hard to explain, but I hope that touches on on what you've tried to address. The second part was, please remind me what you were.
It was about budget constraints and how
budget constraint. I think by and large we haven't tended, well, there are issues about budgets. So the way that budgets are divided tend not to be in terms of disciplinary, but in terms of the work packages. So yes, there will necessarily be constraints on, for example, if I've costed to do get transcription done of a certain number of interviews, and we find we have to do a lot more of those, or it's more expensive than we anticipated, then, you know, that will need to lead to some sort of negotiation between the other components. I mean, those of us who've been doing this for a long time, I guess, have a degree of experience of making sure that we pad things in appropriate ways to hopefully allow for contingencies in any particular areas. Things like translation costs always turn out to be the biggest problems because you can't necessarily anticipate that. But the fact that it's done on the basis essentially of methods rather than disciplines means there should be room for maneuver, and the difficulties tend to come if you have pots of money available within one particular institution and not within another particular institution, because that then may lead to difficulties. So if your microbiology is done in one setting and your anthropology in another, then that slightly makes it more difficult.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure. Thank you. Thanks so much for those perspectives. And thank you for everyone for your questions. I will let Becky take over for the next segment.
Great. Thank you, Helen. Lovely talk. Really enjoyed it.